My own twin sons dropped me at a nursing home like I was garbage they couldn't wait to throw away. The worst part? They smiled while they did it. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. If you also believe that we still have value, even after 60, type 1 in the comments. And please, leave a like and subscribe. Let's show them we're stronger together. My name is Carolyn Margaret Foster, and I'm 74 years old. I live in a small town outside of Springfield, Illinois, where the corn grows tall and neighbors still wave from their front porches. At least they used to wave at me, before my sons decided I was too much trouble to keep around. It was a Tuesday morning in October when my world crumbled. The maple trees outside my kitchen window were ablaze with orange and gold, their leaves catching the early sunlight like tiny flames. I was standing at my kitchen sink, wearing the blue floral house dress my late husband Harold had always loved on me, washing the breakfast dishes in water so hot it turned my hands pink. Steam rose from the porcelain plates as I scrubbed away the remnants of scrambled eggs and toast with strawberry jam, Harold's favorite breakfast, the one I still made for myself every morning, even though he'd been gone 7 months. The house smelled like coffee and the vanilla candle I'd lit at dawn, mixed with the faint scent of Harold's aftershave that still lingered in the air vents no matter how many months passed. Everything was exactly as it should be. Exactly as it had been for the 46 years we'd lived in this house together. The same white lace curtains Harold had hung in 1978. The same wooden spoon rest I'd bought at a church bazaar. The same coffee pot that gurgled and sputtered like an old friend clearing his throat. I was humming Amazing Grace. Harold used to say I had the voice of an angel, though I knew better. When I heard the familiar rumble of Michael's pickup truck in the driveway, my heart did that little skip it always did when one of my boys came to visit. Even at 74, even after raising 2 sons who were now 52 years old with families of their own, I still felt that flutter of maternal joy when they needed their mother. Through the window, I watched Michael step out of his blue Ford F-150, the one with the dent in the passenger door from where his teenage daughter had backed into a mailbox 2 summers ago. He was wearing his good clothes, the navy slacks and white button-down shirt he reserved for church and important occasions. His hair, once the same chestnut brown as mine, was now more silver than anything else, combed neatly to the side the way his father had always worn his. Behind Michael, Matthew emerged from the passenger seat. My twins, born 3 minutes apart 52 years ago, still moved with that eerie synchronization that had amazed doctors and terrified babysitters when they were small. Matthew wore similar clothes, khaki pants and a pale blue shirt that brought out his eyes, Harold's eyes, the color of storm clouds before rain. They both looked serious, worried, the kind of expression I'd seen on their faces when Harold had his first heart attack 5 years ago, when the doctor pulled us into that sterile hospital corridor and used words like significant damage and lifestyle changes. But Harold was gone now, so what could possibly require such grave faces? I dried my hands on the dish towel, the one with roosters that my sister Martha had sent from Iowa, and hurried to the front door. The porch boards creaked under my feet, a sound that had become the soundtrack of my life in this house. Harold always meant to fix those loose boards, but somehow there was always something more pressing, and after a while, the creaking became part of the house's personality, like a dog with a distinctive bark. "Boys!" I called out, pushing open the screen door that squealed on its hinges. "What a wonderful surprise! I just made fresh banana bread last night. Come in, come in. I'll put on more coffee." Michael's smile was tight, strained around the edges like a shirt that didn't quite fit anymore. "Actually, Mom, we were hoping you might want to come for a drive with us. It's such a beautiful day." I looked past them at the October sky, clear and blue as a robin's egg, with just a few wispy clouds drifting lazily overhead. The air carried that crisp bite of autumn, the smell of burning leaves and apple cider. It was beautiful. The kind of day Harold and I used to spend walking through Miller's Woods, collecting acorns and admiring the way the light filtered through the canopy. "A drive sounds lovely," I said, already reaching for the sweater draped over the porch chair. It was the cardigan Michael had given me for Christmas 3 years ago, soft green wool with pearl buttons that caught the light. "Let me just grab my purse and turn off the coffee pot." "Actually," Matthew said, his voice carrying that careful tone I remembered from when the boys were teenagers trying to explain why they'd missed curfew, "we already packed a few things for you. Just in case we decide to stop somewhere for lunch or, well, just in case. He gestured toward the truck, and that's when I noticed the small overnight bag in the back seat. Navy blue with my initials embroidered on the side in white thread. The bag Harold had bought me for our anniversary trip to Branson 2 years before he died. The bag I kept in the hall closet for emergencies or unexpected overnight visits to my sister. "Oh," I said, a flutter of confusion stirring in my chest like a bird trying to find its way out of a barn. "You packed for me? What kind of lunch requires an overnight bag?" Michael and Matthew exchanged a look. One of those silent twin communications that had driven me crazy when they were children. The way they could hold entire conversations with nothing but glances and raised eyebrows. Even now, in their 50s, they still did it. Still excluded everyone else from their private language. "We just thought," Michael began, then stopped, cleared his throat, started again. "We thought it might be nice if we drove out to that new place. You know, near Decatur. They have programs for people who might need a little extra support." The word support hung in the air like smoke from a fire you can't quite locate. I felt something cold settling in my stomach, a sensation I couldn't name but recognized from dreams where you're falling and there's nothing to grab onto. "Support for what?" I asked, my voice smaller than I intended. "I don't need support. I need my boys to visit more often, but I don't need—" "Mom," Matthew interrupted gently. The way you might speak to a child who doesn't understand why the pet goldfish can't sleep in her bed. "You've been through so much. Dad's death, managing the house alone, all those doctor appointments. We just think it might be good for you to have some help. Some companionship." Companionship. Another word that landed wrong, like a puzzle piece forced into the wrong space. I had companionship. I had my neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, who brought me tomatoes from her garden. I had the ladies from my quilting circle who met every Thursday at the community center. I had the mailman, Jerry, who always took time to chat about his grandchildren. I had Harold's memory filling every corner of this house like warm light. But standing there on my porch, looking at my son's carefully arranged faces, I realized with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins that none of that mattered. They had already decided. The bag was packed. The truck was running. They weren't asking for my opinion. They were delivering a verdict I hadn't known was being deliberated. "Just for a little while," Michael added quickly, as if speed could soften the blow. "Just until we figure out the best way to help you adjust to everything. Adjust to everything." As if my entire life, my marriage, my home, my independence, my identity as Harold Foster's wife and Michael and Matthew's mother, was just something to adjust to. Like a new pair of shoes that pinched until you broke them in. I looked at these two men, these strangers wearing my son's faces, and felt something crack inside my chest. Not my heart, that had already been broken 7 months ago when Harold's hand went slack in mine at Springfield Memorial Hospital. This was something else, something that had been holding me together, keeping me upright, maintaining the fiction that I still mattered to the people I had spent my entire adult life loving and serving and sacrificing for. The screen door was still open behind me, and I could hear the coffee pot gurgling in the kitchen, smell the vanilla candle burning on the windowsill, feel the presence of everything that made this place home. In a few hours, it would all be behind me, shrinking in the rearview mirror of Michael's truck as we drove toward whatever transitional care facility they had chosen for their inconvenient mother. I didn't know it yet, but I would never see my kitchen again. Never smell Harold's aftershave in the air vents. Never hear Mrs. Peterson calling hello over the fence while she watered her tomatoes. That Tuesday morning, standing on my porch in my blue floral house dress and Michael's green sweater, I was still Carolyn Foster, wife and mother and keeper of a home that had sheltered 4 decades of family dinners and Christmas mornings and quiet evenings watching television while Harold dozed in his recliner. By Tuesday afternoon, I would just be Carolyn, room 237, another inconvenient elderly woman taking up space in a building that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. The drive to Sunset Manor Assisted Living took 43 minutes. I know because I watched every single digit change on the dashboard clock, each minute carrying me further from everything I'd ever known and closer to a fate I hadn't chosen. Michael drove with his hands positioned precisely at 10 and 2, the way Harold had taught both boys when they turned 16. Matthew sat in the passenger seat, occasionally glancing back at me with what might have been guilt, or might have been impatience. I could no longer tell the difference. Nobody spoke. The radio played soft country music that felt like a mockery of the life I was leaving behind. George Strait sang about blue, clear skies while mine crumbled into gray. As the familiar landmarks of Springfield disappeared in the rearview mirror, the Dairy Queen where I'd taken the boys for birthday treats, the Methodist church where we'd attended every Sunday for 30 years, the elementary school where I'd volunteered in their classrooms, I found myself remembering everything I'd given up for these two men who now couldn't bear to look me in the eye. It started when they were babies, of course. Harold was working double shifts at the grain elevator, trying to make ends meet on a laborer's salary while we paid off the small house on Maple Street. I was 19 when the twins were born, barely more than a child myself, but I threw myself into motherhood with the fierce determination of someone who believed love could overcome any obstacle. I remember those first years in fragments of exhaustion and devotion, feeding one baby while the other cried, changing diapers with one hand while stirring dinner with the other. Harold would come home covered in dust and chaff, his back aching from 12-hour days, and find me still in my nightgown at 6 in the evening, dark circles under my eyes, the house a disaster zone of baby bottles and laundry. "Carolyn, honey," he'd say, taking one of the boys from my arms. "When's the last time you ate something?" I never knew. Time had become measured in feeding schedules and nap times, not meals or personal needs. I lost 30 pounds that first year, not from trying, but from simply forgetting that I, too, was a human being who required nourishment. When the boys were 3, Harold's mother became ill with diabetes complications. She lived in a cramped apartment above Thompson's Hardware, climbing stairs that became increasingly difficult as her circulation worsened. The logical solution, according to Harold's family, was obvious. We had the biggest house, Carolyn was already home with the children, and it would only be temporary. Temporary became 4 years. 4 years of managing Harold's mother's medication schedule, her doctor appointments, her increasingly difficult personality as illness made her bitter and demanding. 4 years of trying to keep 2 energetic toddlers quiet during her afternoon naps, of cooking separate meals because her diet restrictions meant she couldn't eat what we ate, of watching Harold work longer hours to cover the additional expenses while I became a full-time caregiver to 3 people who all needed me completely. I was 23 years old, and I'd already forgotten what it felt like to have a moment that belonged entirely to me. When Harold's mother finally passed, I thought maybe things would get easier. The boys were in school now, and I'd been looking forward to those quiet morning hours. Maybe getting a part-time job, reconnecting with friends I'd lost touch with during the caregiving years. Instead, Harold's sister called 2 weeks after the funeral. "Carolyn, I know this is terrible timing," Linda said, her voice carrying that particular tone people use when they're about to ask for something they know is unreasonable. "But Dad is having such a hard time adjusting to being alone. You know how much he loves being around the boys, and you're so good with older people." Harold's father moved in the following month. This time it was 7 years. 7 years of another medication schedule, another set of doctor appointments, another personality to navigate around. Harold's father was kinder than his mother had been, but he was also needier. He wanted constant conversation, constant attention, constant reassurance that he wasn't a burden, even as he clearly was. He would sit in Harold's recliner, the one Harold never got to sit in anymore because his father had claimed it, and call out questions every few minutes. "Carolyn, what time is it? Carolyn, what's that noise? Carolyn, I think I need my pills. Carolyn, could you make me some tea?" The boys were in middle school by then, old enough to have opinions about their grandfather's presence, but not old enough to help with his care. They complained when he monopolized the television, when his medical equipment cluttered the living room, when they had to be quiet during his naps. "It's not fair," Michael would whine. "Why can't he live somewhere else? Jimmy Peterson's grandpa lives in that nice place near the mall." "Because we take care of family," I would tell them, the same words I'd been telling myself for over a decade. Because family doesn't abandon each other when things get difficult. I didn't realize I was training them to see me as a service provider rather than a person, teaching them that mothers exist to solve problems and absorb inconvenience, showing them, day after day, that my needs would always come last, that my comfort was always negotiable, that my life was something to be organized around everyone else's requirements. When high school arrived, the boys became expensive, not just the normal expenses of teenage boys, the constantly outgrown shoes, the athletic equipment, the gas money, but expensive in ways that required sacrifice on a scale I hadn't anticipated. Michael wanted to play football. The equipment cost $300, money we didn't have. I took a job at Walmart, working evening shifts while Harold watched his father and helped the boys with homework. 4 hours a night, 5 nights a week, standing behind a cash register while teenagers my son's age bought things with their parents' money that I couldn't afford for my own children. Matthew wanted to take advanced art classes, but they required supplies the school couldn't provide. Special pencils, quality paper, paints that cost more than I spent on groceries in a week. I picked up weekend shifts, working Saturday mornings and Sunday afternoons, my feet swelling in the cheap shoes I wore because comfortable ones weren't in the budget. Both boys wanted to go on the senior class trip to Washington, D.C., $400 each, plus spending money. I worked overtime for months, took on extra shifts until Harold worried I was wearing myself down to nothing. "They don't have to go," he said one evening, watching me count tip money I'd saved from the restaurant job I'd added to my retail work. "Plenty of kids don't go on these trips." But I couldn't bear the thought of my boys missing out, being the ones who stayed behind while their classmates made memories that would last a lifetime. I worked 3 jobs that spring: Walmart, the diner, and weekend cleaning for a real estate office, sleeping 4 hours a night and existing on coffee and determination. The boys went to Washington. They came back with stories and souvenirs and photos of themselves grinning in front of monuments I'd only seen in picture books. They showed me everything, excited and grateful, and for a moment it felt worth it. Every sleepless night, every aching foot, every missed dinner with Harold because I was working, it all felt justified by their joy. College was worse. The guidance counselor explained financial aid, but even with grants and scholarships, there were gaps. Room and board, textbooks, fraternity fees, spring break trips, cars so they could come home to visit. I worked every hour I could find. Harold picked up overtime at the grain elevator until his back gave out, and he had to take a desk job that paid less, but didn't require him to lift 60-pound bags all day. We ate generic cereal and marked down meat, drove cars until they literally wouldn't start anymore, wore clothes until they fell apart. But the boys got their degrees. Michael in business, Matthew in engineering. They walked across that stage in caps and gowns I'd photographed from the cheap seats Harold and I could afford, and they hugged us afterward with tears in their eyes. "We couldn't have done this without you, Mom," Matthew said, his diploma clutched in his hand like a golden ticket to a better life. "You sacrificed everything for us," Michael added, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll never forget that." I believed them. God help me, I believed every word. When they graduated and moved to Chicago for their careers, I told myself this was natural. Children grow up. They move away. They build their own lives. The house felt enormous without them, too quiet, too clean. Harold and I rattled around in rooms that had once echoed with teenage voices and slammed doors and music played too loud. But they called every week, visited for holidays, brought girlfriends home to meet us, young women who smiled politely and complimented my cooking and called me Mrs. Foster, with the careful respect of people hoping to make a good impression. When Michael married Jennifer, I planned the entire wedding reception in our backyard, rented tables and chairs, strung lights between the oak trees, made 3 different kinds of cake because I couldn't decide which one looked more professional. Jennifer's mother had wanted to hire a caterer, but I insisted I could handle it. "It's what mothers do," I told Harold when he worried I was taking on too much. "It's my job to make this perfect for them." I worked for 6 months planning that party. Every detail, every decoration, every flower arrangement. The morning of the wedding, I was up at 4 o'clock arranging centerpieces and checking that everything was exactly right. When the last guest left at midnight, I was still cleaning up while the happy couple flew off to their honeymoon in Cancun. Jennifer's thank you note arrived 2 weeks later. "Mrs. Foster," it read in careful handwriting, "thank you for the lovely reception. Everything was very nice. Very nice. 26 weeks of planning, thousands of dollars we couldn't afford, my hands raw from washing dishes and arranging flowers, and it was very nice. But they were happy. That's what mattered." That's what I told myself while I soaked my aching feet and counted the bills that would take us months to pay off. The grandchildren came next. First Michael's daughter Emma, then Matthew's son Tyler, then Jennifer's second pregnancy that ended in twins. 4 grandchildren who lived 6 hours away, who I saw 3 times a year if I was lucky, who called me Grandma Carolyn, with the polite distance of children who barely knew me. When Emma was 10, she needed surgery to correct a vision problem. Insurance would cover most of it, Michael explained during one of our increasingly rare phone calls. But there would be out-of-pocket expenses, co-pays, specialists, time off work. "I hate to ask," he said, though his tone suggested he'd already decided I would say yes. "But Jennifer's parents are helping with their business loan, and things are just really tight right now." I sent them $3,000. Money Harold and I had been saving for a new roof, for the kitchen renovation we'd been planning for 5 years, for the vacation we'd promised ourselves once we finally had a little breathing room. The roof leaked for 2 more winters before we could afford to fix it. The kitchen still has the same avocado appliances from 1979. We never took that vacation, but Emma's eyes were perfect. Michael sent photos of her reading without glasses, her face bright with the joy of clear vision. In the card, she'd written, "Thank you, Grandma Carolyn," in careful 3rd-grade handwriting. It was worth it. Everything was always worth it, as long as they were happy. When Harold's heart started giving him trouble, the boys called more often. Not to check on me, but to ask questions about his condition, his treatment, his prognosis. They wanted updates, but not involvement. Information, but not responsibility. "You're handling everything so well, Mom," Matthew would say during our brief conversations. "You've always been so strong." Strong. The word that meant I could be counted on to manage alone, to solve problems without help, to absorb whatever life threw at our family without complaint or need for support. During Harold's final illness, the boys visited twice, both times for less than 24 hours, flying in on Friday and leaving Saturday evening with explanations about work obligations and soccer games and school events that couldn't be missed. I sat beside Harold's hospital bed for 6 weeks, sleeping in a recliner that left my neck stiff and my back aching, leaving only to shower and change clothes. The boys called every few days for updates, but they had their own lives to live, their own families to worry about. Harold died on a Tuesday morning while I held his hand and hummed "Amazing Grace." The boys arrived that evening for the funeral arrangements, efficient and businesslike, helping me choose a casket and plan a service with the same detached competence they brought to their corporate jobs. They stayed for 3 days, long enough to bury their father, settle the immediate paperwork, and return to their real lives in Chicago. I was left alone in a house full of memories and medical equipment that needed to be returned, with insurance forms to fill out and bills to organize and a future I couldn't imagine. That was 7 months ago. 7 months of learning to cook for one person, of talking to Harold's ghost, of waiting for phone calls that came less and less frequently as my sons settled back into routines that apparently had no room for a grieving mother. And now here I was, watching cornfields blur past the window of Michael's truck, my overnight bag packed with clothes I hadn't chosen, heading toward a destination I hadn't selected. My entire life reduced to whatever these 2 men, these strangers wearing my children's faces, had decided was best. The sign appeared through the windshield like a verdict. Sunset Manor Assisted Living, where family comes first. I almost laughed at the irony, family, as if they had any idea what that word meant. Sunset Manor Assisted Living sat like a beige monument to abandoned hopes on the outskirts of Decatur, Illinois. The building tried to look welcoming with its manicured flower beds and curved driveway, but there was something institutional about its symmetry, something that whispered warehouse for the unwanted beneath its cheerful facade. Michael parked near the main entrance, between a rusted sedan with a "World's Greatest Grandpa" bumper sticker and a pristine Cadillac that probably belonged to someone whose family visited every Sunday with fresh flowers and homemade cookies. I wondered which category I'd fall into, though the sinking feeling in my stomach suggested I already knew. "Here we are," Matthew announced with forced brightness, as if we'd arrived at a vacation resort instead of the place where inconvenient mothers went to disappear quietly. I stared at the glass doors, watching residents shuffle past in wheelchairs and walkers, their faces bearing that particular expression of people who'd given up expecting anything good to happen. A woman about my age sat by the window, staring out at the parking lot with empty eyes, her hands folded in her lap like discarded prayer books. "Mom?" Michael's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you ready?" Ready. What a ridiculous word. Was anyone ever ready to be discarded by their own children? Was there a proper way to prepare for the moment when love revealed itself to be nothing more than convenient habit? "I suppose I don't have much choice," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The lobby smelled like industrial disinfectant mixed with something that might have been intended to evoke flowers, but instead suggested the kind of air freshener used to mask unpleasant odors. The walls were painted that particular shade of institutional beige that was supposed to be soothing, but instead felt like giving up, had been transformed into a color. Behind the reception desk sat a woman in her 40s with processed blonde hair and the professional smile of someone who'd perfected the art of delivering bad news with cheerful efficiency. Her name tag read, Brenda, in letters that matched the facility's logo, all soft curves designed to suggest comfort and care. "You must be Mrs. Foster," Brenda exclaimed with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for surprise parties or lottery winners. "We've been expecting you. Your sons called earlier this week to finalize all the arrangements." Earlier this week. The words hit me like a physical blow. While I'd been humming in my kitchen and planning what to cook for dinner, while I'd been watering Harold's roses and folding laundry, my sons had been on the phone with strangers, arranging my life without a single word to me. "All the paperwork is ready," Brenda continued, sliding a clipboard across the desk. "Just a few signatures and we'll get you settled in your new home." New home. As if home was something you could assign with a signature. As if 46 years of memories and identity could be transferred from one address to another like a magazine subscription. I looked at the forms. Pages of legal text in small print, medical releases, financial authorizations, emergency contacts. My hands shook as I tried to focus on the words, but they seemed to swim on the page like fish in murky water. "What exactly am I signing?" I asked, the question feeling important in ways I couldn't yet articulate. "Oh, just standard admission forms," Brenda said with a dismissive wave. "Authorization for medical care, dietary restrictions, that sort of thing. Your sons have already handled the financial arrangements, so you don't need to worry about any of that." Financial arrangements. I felt a cold stab of fear in my chest. "What financial arrangements?" Michael stepped forward, his hand touching my shoulder in what might have been meant as comfort but felt more like restraint. "Don't worry about it, Mom. We've got everything covered." But I was worrying about it. Harold had always handled our finances, but after his death, I'd learned enough to know we had savings. Not a lot, but enough to cover my expenses for several years if I was careful. The house was paid off. Harold's life insurance had covered the funeral costs, and his pension provided a modest but adequate monthly income. "I'd like to understand what financial arrangements you've made," I said, my voice carrying a firmness that surprised all three of us. Matthew and Michael exchanged that look again, the one that excluded me from their private communication. Brenda's smile faltered slightly, like a television signal struggling to maintain reception. "Perhaps we could discuss the financial details in private," she suggested, glancing meaningfully at the boys. "I am Mrs. Foster," I said with growing clarity. "Whatever financial arrangements concern me should be discussed with me." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Somewhere down the hall, a television played game show music, the cheerful sounds grotesquely inappropriate for the conversation we were having. An elderly man in a wheelchair rolled past, pushed by a young aide who was talking on her phone about weekend plans that didn't include pushing wheelchairs. Finally, Michael sighed. "Mom, we've set up an arrangement where your care will be covered by, well, by the sale of some assets." "What assets?" The words came out sharper than I intended. But I was past caring about politeness. The house, primarily, Matthew said, his voice careful and measured. And we've consolidated your accounts to make everything more manageable. The room tilted sideways. The cheerful beige walls seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, and I had to grip the edge of the reception desk to keep from falling. You sold my house? My voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the lobby like a scream. We're in the process of selling it, Michael corrected, as if the distinction mattered. The market is really good right now, and the money will more than cover your care here for several years. Several years. They'd calculated how long I was likely to live and budgeted accordingly. They'd reduced my remaining life to a financial equation where my death was the variable that would determine their inheritance. And my accounts? We've simplified things, Matthew explained with the patient tone of someone explaining basic concepts to a child. Combined everything into a trust that will cover your expenses here. It's much more efficient this way. Efficient. That word again. I was being processed like a business transaction, my entire life reorganized for their convenience and profit. I didn't authorize any of this, I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I remembered the papers Harold had made me sign before his surgery. For emergencies, he'd said, just in case something happens to me and you need help managing things. Power of attorney. I'd signed it thinking I was being responsible, preparing for a future where I might need assistance. I hadn't realized I was signing away my right to exist as an independent human being. We're doing this because we love you, Mom, Michael said, but his eyes wouldn't meet mine. Because we want to make sure you're taken care of. Taken care of. Like a pet that had become too much trouble to keep at home. Brenda had been watching this exchange with the practiced neutrality of someone who'd witnessed similar family dramas countless times before. Now she cleared her throat delicately and gestured toward the clipboard. If you could just sign here, Mrs. Foster, we can get you settled in your room. I think you'll find it very comfortable. I stared at the signature line. At the place where my name would make this nightmare official. Once I signed, I would become a resident of Sunset Manor, a woman who'd been discarded by her children and forgotten by the world. But what choice did I have? My house was sold, or being sold. My money was locked away in accounts I apparently couldn't access. I had nowhere to go, no resources to fight with, no one to call for help. I signed my name with a hand that trembled like autumn leaves in a storm. Room 237 was exactly as comfortable as Brenda had promised, if your definition of comfort involved institutional furniture and the lingering scent of bleach mixed with despair. The bed was narrow and hospital-like, with metal rails that could be raised or lowered depending on how helpless you'd become. The dresser was bolted to the wall, as if they expected the residents to either steal the furniture or forget where they'd put it. The window faced the parking lot, offering a view of cars that came and went while the people inside these walls remained trapped like insects in amber. I could see Michael's truck from where I sat on the edge of the bed, my overnight bag unopened beside me. This is really nice, Mom, Matthew said, his voice hollow with false enthusiasm. Look, you have your own bathroom and there's a call button right here if you need anything. A call button. So I could summon strangers when I needed help, instead of relying on family who had already demonstrated their eagerness to be elsewhere. And the dining room serves 3 meals a day, Michael added, checking his watch with the obvious impatience of someone who had accomplished an unpleasant task and wanted to leave. They have activities too. Bingo, crafts, music therapy. Music therapy. As if listening to someone play Amazing Grace on an electric keyboard could heal the wound of being abandoned by your own children. We should probably get going, Matthew said, already moving toward the door. Traffic back to the city gets heavy on Tuesday evenings. They were leaving. Of course they were leaving. This had never been about my comfort or well-being. It had been about removing an inconvenience from their lives so they could return to their real families, their real responsibilities, their real lives that had no room for an aging mother who reminded them of mortality and obligation. When will you visit? I asked, hating the desperate note in my voice, but unable to stop myself from asking. Soon, Michael said, the word empty of meaning, as soon as we can manage it. Maybe for your birthday, Matthew suggested. That's only 4 months away. 4 months. They were planning to leave me here for 4 months without a visit, as if I were a sweater they'd put in storage until the weather changed. They each gave me awkward hugs, the kind of embrace you'd offer a distant relative at a funeral. Brief, obligatory, designed to fulfill social expectations without conveying actual affection. Their cologne smelled expensive, foreign, like the scent of a life I was no longer part of. "Take care of yourself, Mom," Michael said, and I almost laughed at the irony. Take care of myself. In a place where strangers controlled my meals, my activities, my medication, my very existence. "We love you," Matthew added, the words falling flat in the sterile air of room 237. And then they were gone, their footsteps echoing down the hallway, growing fainter and fainter, until they disappeared entirely. I heard Michael's truck start in the parking lot, heard the engine rev as they drove away, taking with them any pretense that I still mattered to the people I'd spent my entire adult life loving and serving. I sat on the narrow bed and looked around my new world, 4 walls the color of disappointment, a bathroom barely large enough to turn around in, a closet that could hold perhaps a quarter of the clothes I'd accumulated over 74 years of life. This was what a lifetime of sacrifice had earned me. This was the reward for putting everyone else's needs before my own, for working 3 jobs to pay for their college education, for caring for Harold's parents until they died, for planning perfect weddings and sending money for grandchildren's surgeries and never once asking what I might need or want for myself. I had raised 2 sons who saw me as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved, who could calculate the cost of my care down to the penny but couldn't spare a weekend to help me adjust to widowhood, who could organize my entire future without consulting me but couldn't remember to call and ask how I was feeling. The truth settled over me like a heavy blanket. I had been used. For 53 years, since the moment Michael and Matthew were born, I had been a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be cherished. Every sacrifice I'd made had been cataloged not as evidence of love, but as proof that I could be counted on to give up whatever was asked of me without complaint or resistance. I opened my overnight bag with mechanical precision, hanging my few clothes in the narrow closet, placing my toiletries on the bathroom counter that barely had space for a toothbrush and a tube of face cream. At the bottom of the bag, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, I found something that made my breath catch in my throat. A photograph of Harold and me on our wedding day, both of us grinning with the idiotic optimism of people who believed love conquered everything. I was 22, he was 24, and we thought we were building something permanent and beautiful. I set the photograph on the bedside table, next to the call button I would never use unless I was literally dying. Harold's face smiled back at me, frozen in time, preserved in the moment before life taught us that love wasn't always enough, that good intentions couldn't protect you from the casual cruelty of people who took your devotion for granted. "I'm sorry, honey," I whispered to his image. "I'm sorry they turned out this way." Outside my window, the sun was setting over the parking lot, painting the asphalt in shades of orange and gold that might have been beautiful under different circumstances. Cars continued to come and go, families visiting, staff leaving after their shifts, delivery trucks bringing supplies to keep this warehouse of forgotten people functioning. But no one was coming for me. No one would be coming tomorrow, or next week, or next month. I was finally completely alone. And for the first time in my adult life, I began to wonder, was I used? The first 3 days at Sunset Manor passed in a haze of institutional routine that felt like drowning in slow motion. Breakfast at 7:30, watery scrambled eggs and toast that tasted like cardboard. Lunch at noon, some variation of soup and sandwich that all seemed to share the same bland, antiseptic flavor. Dinner at 5:30, mystery meat with overcooked vegetables that had been steamed into submission. Between meals, I sat in my room and waited. For what? I wasn't entirely sure. A phone call, perhaps. A visit. Some acknowledgement that I existed somewhere other than the liability column of my son's mental accounting. The waiting stretched like taffy, each hour longer than the last. I found myself checking the hallway every time I heard footsteps, hoping to see a familiar face that never appeared. The phone in my room remained stubbornly silent, its black plastic surface reflecting nothing but my own growing desperation. On Thursday morning, I finally gathered the courage to call Michael's house. Jennifer answered on the 3rd ring, her voice carrying that particular brand of cheerful distraction, that suggested she was multitasking her way through a busy morning. "Oh, hi, Mrs. Foster," she said when I identified myself. There was a slight pause, the kind that happens when someone is trying to shift mental gears from whatever they were doing to something they'd rather not deal with. "How are you?" Settling in. Settling in. As if I were adjusting to a new apartment rather than grieving the loss of everything I'd ever called home. "I'm having some difficulty adjusting," I said carefully, testing the waters. "I was wondering if Michael might have time to visit this weekend, or perhaps I could speak with him about some of the arrangements." Another pause, longer this time. I could hear voices in the background, children arguing about something, the television playing cartoons, the normal sounds of a family morning that I was no longer part of. "Well, this weekend is really busy," Jennifer said finally. "Emma has a soccer tournament, and Michael promised to help his brother move some furniture. Maybe next weekend? Maybe next weekend." The same non-committal promise that had been echoing through my relationship with my sons for months. Always next time, next weekend, next month, always later, when it was more convenient, when their real lives had room for the inconvenience of their mother. "Could I speak with Michael for just a moment?" I asked, hating the pleading note that had crept into my voice. "He's already left for work," Jennifer said quickly. Too quickly. I could hear him in the background, his voice distinct even though I couldn't make out the words. "But I'll definitely tell him you called." She hung up before I could respond, leaving me holding a dead phone and the crushing realization that my daughter-in-law had just lied to me with the casual ease of someone who'd had practice. I called Matthew next, but it went straight to voicemail. His outgoing message was professionally recorded, all business efficiency. "You've reached Matthew Foster. Please leave a detailed message and I'll return your call at my earliest convenience." "Matthew, this is your mother," I said to the machine, feeling foolish for having to identify myself. "I'm calling from Sunset Manor. I have some concerns about the arrangements you and Michael made, and I'd really appreciate a call back. The number here is—" I recited the facility's main number, then added quietly, "I love you, son. Please call me back." He didn't. By Friday, I'd left 3 more messages for Matthew and called Michael's house twice more, reaching only Jennifer's increasingly strained politeness and increasingly creative excuses. Michael was at a client dinner. Michael was helping a neighbor with a plumbing emergency. Michael was at a work retreat that had come up suddenly. The lies were getting more elaborate, which somehow made them more insulting than simple silence would have been. On Saturday morning, I tried a different approach. I called Michael's office, thinking maybe I could catch him there. Surely he couldn't avoid his own mother if she called his workplace. "Foster Financial Consulting," a young woman answered with professional brightness. "This is Ashley. How may I help you?" "I'd like to speak with Michael Foster, please. This is his mother." "Oh!" Ashley's voice warmed immediately. "Mr. Foster talks about you all the time, but I'm afraid he's not in today. He took a long weekend to spend some quality time with his family." Quality time with his family. The words hit me like a slap. I was his family. I was his mother. The woman who'd given birth to him, raised him, sacrificed everything to give him the education and opportunities that had made his comfortable life possible. But apparently, family was now defined as people young enough to be useful rather than burdensome. "Could you please tell him his mother called?" I asked, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. "Of course. I'll make sure he gets the message first thing Monday morning." But Monday came and went without a return call. Tuesday passed in silence. By Wednesday, I realized with the clarity of someone who'd been clinging to false hope that my sons had made a decision I wasn't going to be consulted about. They intended to simply disappear from my life. The other residents at Sunset Manor began to notice my isolation. During our shared meals in the dining room, a space decorated with artificial plants and motivational posters that seemed designed to mock the reality of our abandoned lives, I sat alone while others clustered around tables in small groups bound by common complaints about ungrateful children and forgotten birthdays. "New here?" asked a woman named Dorothy, sliding her tray across from mine during Thursday lunch. She was probably in her late 70s, with silver hair cut in a practical bob and eyes that held the particular sharpness of someone who'd stopped believing in comfortable lies. "Almost 2 weeks now," I said, cutting my rubbery chicken into pieces I had no intention of eating. Family visit yet? The question was casual, but I could see Dorothy watching my face with the attention of someone who'd learned to read the landscape of abandonment in other people's expressions. Not yet. They're very busy, Dorothy snorted, a sound that contained decades of experience with very busy children. They always are, honey. Let me guess. Important jobs, young families, couldn't possibly spare a weekend to visit the woman who wiped their noses and paid for their college education. The accuracy of her assessment was so precise it took my breath away. How did you know? Because I've been here for 3 years, and I've watched the same story play out with half the people in this place. Dorothy gestured around the dining room with her fork, indicating the tables full of elderly people whose children had apparently discovered that love was a renewable resource that ran out when it became inconvenient. My son David used to call every Sunday, Dorothy continued, her voice matter-of-fact rather than bitter. Regular as clockwork. Then his wife decided I was too negative, after I pointed out that their 16-year-old daughter was dating a boy with a motorcycle and a criminal record. David chose his wife's comfort over his mother's wisdom. Haven't heard from either of them since Christmas. And that was just a card with a pre-printed message and no personal note. I stared at her, seeing my own future reflected in her casual acceptance of abandonment. Don't you want to fight? To make them understand? Honey, you can't make someone love you, and you can't make someone feel grateful for sacrifices they've decided don't count anymore. Dorothy took a bite of her green beans, chewed thoughtfully, then added, "The question isn't whether they'll come around. The question is whether you're going to spend whatever time you have left waiting for people who've already moved on." That afternoon, I decided to call my granddaughter Emma directly. She was 16 now, old enough to have her own phone, old enough to make her own decisions about whether to maintain contact with her grandmother. Surely Michael couldn't control his daughter's choices the way he was controlling mine. I managed to get Emma's number from the facility's directory assistants, the same number I'd used to call her on her birthday 6 months ago, when she'd seemed genuinely happy to hear from me and had chattered about school and friends and the art classes she was taking. The phone rang 4 times before she answered, and I could hear the wariness in her voice when she said hello. "Emma, sweetie, it's Grandma Carolyn." A pause. Then, in a voice that sounded carefully coached, "Oh, hi, Grandma. I can't really talk right now. I'm doing homework." "I just wanted to hear your voice," I said, fighting back tears. "I'm staying in a new place now, and I thought maybe you might like to visit sometime. We could go out for ice cream, like we used to when you were little." Another pause, longer this time. When Emma spoke again, her voice was smaller, younger, like the little girl she'd been before someone taught her that grandmothers were disposable. Dad says you're getting the help you need now, and we shouldn't interfere with your treatment. Treatment. As if my grief over losing Harold, my confusion about being abandoned by my sons, my devastation at having my entire life dismantled without my consent, were symptoms of an illness rather than natural responses to unnatural cruelty. "Emma, I'm not sick," I said gently. "I'm just sad and lonely, and I miss my family. That's not something that needs treatment. It's something that needs love." I could hear her crying now, soft sniffles that she was trying to hide. "I miss you too, Grandma. But Dad says, he says it's better this way, that you'll be happier with people your own age." Happier. Michael had convinced his teenage daughter that abandoning me was an act of kindness, that dumping me in an institution was somehow for my own benefit. "I love you, Emma," I said, knowing this would probably be the last time I'd hear her voice for a very long time. "No matter what anyone tells you, I want you to know that I love you, and I'm proud of you." "I love you too, Grandma," she whispered. And then the line went dead. I sat in my institutional chair in my institutional room and felt something break inside me that had been holding on by threads for 2 weeks. Not my heart. That had shattered the day Harold died. This was something else. Some fundamental belief about the nature of family, about the meaning of love, about the value of a life spent in service to others. That evening, during what the staff called social hour, a period when residents were encouraged to gather in the common room and pretend to enjoy each other's company, while game shows played on a television mounted too high on the wall for anyone to actually see clearly, I sat next to a woman named Margaret who was working on a crossword puzzle with shaking hands. 7 letters, she muttered, squinting at the small print. Betrayed by one's own family. I looked at the crossword, at the empty squares waiting to be filled with an answer to a puzzle that had become my life. Abandoned, I said quietly. Margaret looked up at me with surprise, then back at the puzzle. She counted the letters, nodded, and carefully wrote the word in block letters across the grid. Perfect fit, she said with satisfaction. Then she looked at me more closely, her roomy eyes focusing with sudden sharpness. You okay, honey? You look like someone just walked over your grave. I almost laughed at the accuracy of her observation. Someone had walked over my grave. Several someones, in fact. They'd buried me alive and walked away, leaving me to figure out how to survive in a world where I no longer existed, except as a problem that had been solved. I'm fine, I lied, because what was the point of explaining that fine was just another word for functioning while dead inside? But Margaret wasn't fooled. She reached over and patted my hand with fingers that were bent with arthritis but still capable of offering comfort. No, you're not, she said matter-of-factly. But maybe that's not the end of the story. Maybe being not fine is just the beginning of figuring out what you actually are. That night, lying in my narrow bed and staring at the ceiling tiles that had probably witnessed thousands of similar nights of abandonment and despair, I found myself thinking about Margaret's words, about Dorothy's matter-of-fact acceptance of her son's betrayal, about Emma's tearful whisper that she loved me even as she followed her father's instructions to cut me out of her life. And I began to wonder, what was I really, if I wasn't Michael and Matthew's mother? Who was Carolyn Foster when stripped of her identity as a woman who existed to serve others? For 74 years, I'd defined myself by my relationships to other people. Harold's wife, Michael and Matthew's mother, Emma and Tyler's grandmother, the woman who took care of everyone else's needs while neglecting her own. But now, alone in room 237 with only the ghost of Harold's photograph for company, I had to confront a question I'd never bothered to ask. Who was I when no one needed me anymore? The answer, I was beginning to suspect, might surprise everyone, including myself. 3 weeks into my residency at Sunset Manor, something unexpected happened. I stopped waiting for the phone to ring. It wasn't a conscious decision, like waking up one morning and deciding to be different. It was more like the way a fever breaks, gradual, then sudden, leaving you weak but clear-headed. I simply looked at the black telephone on my bedside table one Tuesday morning and realized I no longer felt the familiar twist of hope and dread in my stomach when I considered calling my sons. They had made their position clear through the eloquence of silence. I was a chapter in their lives that had been finished, filed away, forgotten, except when paperwork required their attention, or when someone asked after their mother at social gatherings. She's in a lovely facility, I imagined Jennifer saying at her book club meetings. Very comfortable. We made sure she has everything she needs. Everything except the people who were supposed to love her. But that detail would be diplomatically omitted. The realization should have devastated me. Instead, it felt oddly liberating, like setting down a heavy suitcase you'd been carrying for miles without realizing how much it was weighing you down. That morning, instead of sitting in my room and staring at the phone, I decided to explore the facility properly. For 3 weeks, I'd moved through Sunset Manor like a ghost, attending meals and activities with the mechanical compliance of someone going through the motions of living. But now, with my son's rejection finally accepted, rather than fought, I found myself actually seeing the place for the first time. The common room was larger than I'd noticed, with tall windows that faced west toward a garden where someone had planted roses that were still blooming despite the October chill. The furniture was institutional, but it was arranged in conversational clusters rather than the prison-like rows I'd imagined. A baby grand piano sat in one corner, its bench worn smooth by decades of use. "Do you play?" asked a voice behind me. I turned to find a man in his 80s watching me with intelligent brown eyes. He was tall and lean, with silver hair combed carefully and clothes that suggested he'd once had money. His name tag read, Dr. James Morrison, in the careful handwriting of someone who still took pride in proper penmanship. "I used to," I said, surprised to hear myself admitting it. "Not well, but I enjoyed it. My mother insisted on lessons when I was young. The piano's been silent for months," Dr. Morrison said, settling onto the bench and running his fingers over the keys without pressing them. Mrs. Patterson was our pianist, but she passed in August. None of us has had the heart to touch it since. Something about his tone, respectful rather than maudlin, made me step closer. What did she like to play? Everything. Bach when she was feeling intellectual, show tunes when she wanted to make people smile, hymns on Sunday mornings for those who missed church. His fingers found middle C and pressed it gently, the single note hanging in the air like a question. She said music was one of the few things that couldn't be taken away from you, even when everything else was gone. I thought about the piano in Harold's in my living room, the one I'd played for the boys when they were small, pecking out simple melodies while they giggled and requested "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" for the 100th time. It had been sold along with everything else, probably hauled away by strangers who had no idea it had once been the soundtrack to bedtime stories and Christmas mornings. "May I?" I asked, gesturing toward the bench. Dr. Morrison slid over to make room, and I sat beside him, my fingers hovering over the keys like a bird uncertain about landing. It had been years since I'd played. There had been no time for music while caring for Harold during his illness, no heart for it after his death. But my hands remembered. They found the opening notes of Amazing Grace without conscious thought, the melody flowing from muscle memory older than my grief. The sound was thin at first, tentative, but as the familiar hymn progressed, something loosened in my chest. By the second verse, my voice joined the music, quiet but true. By the third verse, I heard other voices harmonizing. Dr. Morrison's baritone, a woman's alto from across the room, a shaky tenor from someone I couldn't see. When the song ended, the silence was different than it had been before. Not empty, but full, expectant. "That was beautiful," said a woman I recognized from the dining room. Ruth, who usually sat at the table near the window and rarely spoke to anyone. "I haven't heard that song sung properly in months. My grandmother used to sing it while she did the washing," added another voice. Said it made the work feel less like work. I looked around the room and realized something remarkable had happened. People had gathered without my noticing. Residents who'd been scattered throughout the common area had drifted closer, drawn by the music like flowers turning toward sunlight. For the first time since arriving at Sunset Manor, I saw their faces as individuals rather than fellow inmates in this warehouse of the forgotten. "Could you play Moon River?" asked a tiny woman with perfectly styled white hair. "It was my husband's favorite. We danced to it at our anniversary party every year." I found the opening chords more easily than I'd expected, and the small woman, whose name tag read Evelyn, began to sing in a voice that had once been trained, still clear despite her 80-something years. As she sang about dreamers and Rainbow's End, I watched her face transform. The institutional pallor faded, replaced by something that looked almost like joy. Over the following weeks, the piano became my refuge, and, unexpectedly, my purpose. Every afternoon at 3 o'clock, I made my way to the common room and played whatever songs people requested. Hymns for those who found comfort in faith, old standards for those who remembered dancing, folk songs that carried memories of simpler times. The staff noticed the change in atmosphere. Residents who'd spent months sitting silently in their rooms began emerging for what they started calling Carolyn's concerts. People smiled more. Conversations started. The common room filled with something it had been missing: community. "You've brought life back to this place," said Nancy, one of the younger nurses who actually seemed to enjoy her work rather than simply enduring it. Mrs. Patterson was wonderful, but she played mostly classical music. "You play the songs that live in people's hearts. The songs that live in people's hearts." The phrase stayed with me as I played requests for Danny Boy and Blue Moon and In the Sweet By and By. These weren't just melodies. They were repositories of memory, connections to times when the people in this room had been young and hopeful and surrounded by people who loved them. Like me, they'd been discarded when they became inconvenient. But unlike me, many of them had found ways to create meaning in their reduced circumstances. Dr. Morrison organized discussion groups about books and current events. Ruth tended a small herb garden in the courtyard, sharing fresh basil and rosemary with the kitchen staff. Evelyn taught anyone interested how to play bridge, turning the card table near the window into a hub of gentle competition and laughter. They weren't just waiting to die. They were living, differently than before, more simply, but with an authenticity I was beginning to understand I'd never experienced during my decades of self-sacrifice. "You know what I don't miss?" Dorothy said one evening as we sat together in the common room after dinner. She was working on a crossword puzzle while I sorted through sheet music I'd requested from the library. "I don't miss cooking 3 meals a day for people who barely acknowledged the effort. I don't miss cleaning up after grown men who couldn't be bothered to put their dishes in the dishwasher. I don't miss pretending to be interested in football games and stock prices and all the other things my son considered important." She looked up from her puzzle, her eyes bright with something that might have been relief. "For the first time in 60 years, I get to eat what I want, when I want it. I can read mystery novels without someone complaining that I'm wasting time. I can watch whatever I want on television without negotiating with people who think their preferences matter more than mine." She paused, then added quietly, "I should have been angrier about all those years of accommodation, but I thought that's what love looked like. Disappearing yourself to make room for other people's needs." Her words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. I had spent 53 years disappearing myself, piece by piece, accommodation by accommodation, until there was almost nothing left of the woman I might have been if I'd believed I deserved to take up space in my own life. "Who were you before you became someone's wife and mother?" Dorothy asked, as if she could read my thoughts. It was a simple question that should have had a simple answer, but I found myself staring at her, speechless, because I genuinely couldn't remember. I'd been 19 when I married Harold, barely out of my parents' house and into his. I'd gone from being my father's daughter to Harold's wife to Michael and Matthew's mother without ever asking what Carolyn might want for herself. "I don't know," I admitted, the words feeling like a confession of some fundamental failure. "Then maybe it's time to find out," Dorothy said matter-of-factly, returning to her crossword as if she hadn't just suggested the most radical idea I'd ever encountered. That night, for the first time since arriving at Sunset Manor, I didn't fall asleep thinking about my son's abandonment or Harold's absence or the life I'd lost. Instead, I found myself wondering about the life I'd never lived, the woman I might have been if I'd believed I was worth caring about. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror not to check if I was presentable for other people, but to see what was actually there. The face that looked back at me was older than I'd remembered, lined with years of worry about other people's problems and disappointments. But the eyes were still clear, still intelligent. The hands were still capable. They'd found their way around piano keys after years of neglect, after all. There was still a person in there. Someone who might have opinions and preferences and dreams that had nothing to do with making other people comfortable. For the first time in my adult life, I was curious about who that person might be. Later that morning, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. I walked to the facility's administrative office and asked to speak with someone about the financial arrangements my sons had made. "I'd like to understand exactly what resources are available to me," I told the administrator, a competent-looking woman named Sarah who seemed genuinely surprised by my request. "Most families prefer to handle those details themselves," she said carefully, "but you certainly have the right to review your own account information." My own account. Not my son's account that happened to pay for my care, but mine. The distinction felt important in ways I was just beginning to understand. Sarah pulled out a thick folder and spread papers across her desk. Financial statements, insurance information, asset valuations. As she explained the numbers, I felt something stirring in my chest that I barely recognized. Hope. There was more money than I'd expected, much more. The sale of my house, combined with Harold's life insurance and my modest savings, had created a fund that could support me for years, even decades if I lived that long. More importantly, according to the power of attorney documents, I could revoke my son's authority over these funds at any time by simply filing the proper paperwork. "Would you like me to help you understand your options?" Sarah asked, watching my face as I processed this information. "Yes," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in months. "I think I would." As I walked back to my room that afternoon, sheet music tucked under my arm and financial documents in my purse, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Harold's death, a sense of possibility. My sons had tried to erase me, to reduce me to a problem they could solve by writing checks to an institution, but they'd made a crucial mistake. They'd assumed I was as powerless as I'd always believed myself to be. They were about to discover how wrong they were. The attorney's office smelled like leather and old paper, with the kind of quiet that suggested important decisions were made here regularly. I sat across from Robert Hendricks, a man in his 60s who'd come highly recommended by Sarah, the facility administrator. His gray hair was perfectly styled, his suit expensive but not flashy, and his manner suggested he'd seen enough family drama to remain unshocked by whatever story I might tell. "Mrs. Foster," he said, reviewing the documents I'd brought, "this is quite a comprehensive power of attorney your sons had you sign. They essentially have control over every aspect of your financial life." "Had me sign," I repeated, tasting the passive voice like something bitter. "Yes, they did. While my husband was in the hospital, dying, they said it was for emergencies." Mr. Hendricks nodded without judgment. "Unfortunately, this is more common than you might think. Adult children often convince elderly parents to sign these documents just in case, then use them to make decisions that serve their own interests rather than their parents." He spread the papers across his mahogany desk like evidence in a trial I was finally ready to fight. "The good news is that you were competent when you signed this, and you're clearly competent now. You can revoke their authority at any time." Competent. Such a simple word, but it felt revolutionary. For months, I'd been treated as though my inability to predict my son's betrayal was evidence of mental decline rather than proof of their deception. "What would that mean, practically speaking?" I asked. "It means you regain full control of your finances, your bank accounts, your investments, any remaining assets. They would have no legal authority to make decisions on your behalf." He paused, studying my face. "It also means they would lose access to information about your financial situation. They wouldn't know how much money you have or how you choose to spend it." The idea sent a thrill of excitement through me that I hadn't felt since I was young. Independence, privacy, the radical concept that my money was actually mine to control. "There's something else you should know," Mr. Hendricks continued, pulling out another document. "I did some research on the sale of your house. Your sons listed themselves as your agents under the power of attorney, but they sold the property for significantly less than its appraised value." My stomach clenched. "What does that mean?" "It means they prioritized a quick sale over maximizing your assets. The house sold for $215,000. Recent comparable sales in your neighborhood suggest it should have sold for at least $260,000, possibly more. $45,000. Nearly $50,000 of my money, lost because my sons couldn't be bothered to wait for the right buyer or invest in basic improvements that might have increased the value. Why would they do that?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. "Because they weren't spending their own money," Mr. Hendricks said bluntly. "Quick sale, quick commission to the realtor, quick resolution to what they saw as a problem. The fact that it cost you tens of thousands of dollars was irrelevant to them. The casualness of their disregard for my financial well-being hit me like a physical blow. These weren't the mistakes of loving children overwhelmed by responsibility. These were the actions of people who saw my assets as theirs to dispose of as conveniently as possible. I want to revoke their power of attorney," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Today, if possible." Mr. C. Hendricks smiled, the first genuinely warm expression I'd seen from him. "I was hoping you'd say that. I've already prepared the documents." 2 hours later, I walked out of his office with copies of the revocation documents and a new will that eliminated my sons entirely. Instead, my modest estate would go to organizations that actually helped elderly people, groups that provided in-home care, facilities that treated residents with dignity, programs that recognized that growing old didn't mean becoming worthless. But more importantly, I walked out with something I hadn't possessed in months: power. The first thing I did was call the bank. Speaking to the manager directly, I requested immediate access to my accounts and all records of transactions my sons had authorized. Within an hour, I was sitting in the bank's conference room, reviewing statements that told the story of my systematic financial exploitation. Beyond the house sale, they'd moved money between accounts without my knowledge, closed the high-yield savings account Harold and I had maintained for emergencies, and redirected my Social Security payments to an account I hadn't even known existed. They'd used my debit card for purchases I'd never authorized: gas, groceries, even a weekend getaway to Lake Geneva that they'd apparently considered a necessary break from the stress of managing their inconvenient mother. "We can reverse the automatic payments and restore your access immediately," the bank manager assured me. "As for the unauthorized purchases, we'll need to investigate, but you may be able to recover some of those funds." That evening, I called Sunset Manor's billing department and made arrangements to pay my own expenses going forward. No more mystery payments from accounts I couldn't access. No more dependence on sons who demonstrated that my well-being was negotiable. "Will there be any problem with the payment arrangements your family set up?" asked the billing coordinator. "There won't be any family arrangements going forward," I said, surprised by how good it felt to say those words. "I'll be handling my own affairs." The next morning, I did something I'd been planning since my conversation with Dorothy weeks earlier. I drove, in a rental car I'd arranged myself, back to Springfield. The 43-minute drive felt like traveling through time. Every familiar landmark carried new meaning now that I saw them through the eyes of someone who'd been betrayed and abandoned, then found the strength to reclaim her own life. My house, former house, looked smaller than I remembered. The new owners had painted the front door red and planted mums in the flower boxes Harold had built. It was still beautiful, but it no longer felt like home. It felt like a place I'd visited long ago, in a different life. I parked across the street and sat for a few minutes, not with grief, but with a strange sense of closure. This house had sheltered decades of memories, but it had also been the stage for my gradual disappearance. Maybe losing it hadn't been entirely a tragedy. Maybe it had been a necessary severing of ties to a version of myself who'd believed that love meant erasing yourself for other people's comfort. My real destination was the law firm where Harold had done business, the same firm where I'd found Mr. Hendricks. But first, I made a stop that felt both practical and symbolic. The Springfield Savings Bank, where Harold and I had opened our first checking account 46 years ago, still occupied the same corner building downtown. I walked through the heavy glass doors with the confidence of someone who had money and the legal right to control it. "I'd like to open a new account," I told the young banker who greeted me. "Checking and savings, and I'd like to arrange for a safe deposit box." As I filled out the paperwork, using my maiden name as a middle name for the first time since my marriage, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just a financial transaction, it was a declaration of independence. The safe deposit box was for the jewelry Harold had given me over the years. Pieces I'd been too sentimental to sell, but too heartbroken to wear. My engagement ring, the pearl necklace he'd surprised me with on our 10th anniversary, the diamond earrings that had been his last gift before his death. But as I locked them away in the steel box, I realized I wasn't preserving them out of grief anymore. I was protecting them from sons who might consider them assets to be liquidated when I was no longer around to object. That afternoon, I drove to Michael's neighborhood in the suburbs north of Springfield. I'd been to his house only a handful of times, usually for carefully orchestrated holiday gatherings where I was expected to be grateful for the privilege of seeing my own family. The house was exactly as I remembered, a sprawling colonial with a perfectly manicured lawn and an attached garage that housed cars worth more than I'd spent on transportation in my entire adult life. Michael's blue pickup truck sat in the driveway, next to Jennifer's silver SUV, and I could see lights on in what I knew was the family room. I sat in my rental car for a full 5 minutes, gathering the courage for what I was about to do. Then I walked up the brick pathway and rang the doorbell with the firm pressure of someone who had every right to be there. Jennifer answered, and the expression that crossed her face was like watching someone realize they'd been caught in a lie. Surprise, guilt, and annoyance flickered across her features before settling into the polite mask she'd perfected for unpleasant social situations. "Mrs. Foster, what a surprise. Michael didn't mention you were out. as if I'd been in prison rather than abandoned in an institution by her husband. "May I come in?" I asked, not waiting for an answer before stepping across the threshold. "I'd like to speak with Michael and Matthew. I believe Matthew is here as well?" I could hear voices from the family room. Both my sons, their children, the comfortable sounds of people who belonged somewhere, people who mattered to each other. "Well, we're just having a quiet family evening," Jennifer said, clearly hoping I'd take the hint and leave. "Perfect," I said with a smile that felt sharp as glass. "Since I'm family." I walked toward the voices without waiting for permission, leaving Jennifer to follow behind me like a hostess whose dinner party had just been crashed by an uninvited guest. The family room was exactly as I'd expected. Expensive furniture arranged around a large television, children's toys scattered across a carpet that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Michael and Matthew sat on opposite ends of a leather sectional, both holding beer bottles and wearing the relaxed expressions of men who had no pressing concerns about abandoned mothers or financial exploitation. Emma, now 17 and even more beautiful than I remembered, sat on the floor doing homework. Tyler, Matthew's 14-year-old son, was absorbed in some kind of handheld game. The twins, Jennifer's youngest, now 10 years old, were building something elaborate with Legos. When I walked into the room, the adult conversation stopped as if someone had pulled a plug. Michael's face went through the same emotional progression I'd witnessed with Jennifer. Surprise, guilt, annoyance. "Mom," he said, setting down his beer with the careful precision of someone buying time to think. "What are you doing here?" "I came to talk to my sons," I said, settling into an armchair that put me directly in their line of sight, "about some financial irregularities that have come to my attention." Matthew's face had gone pale. "Financial irregularities?" "The power of attorney you had me sign," I said conversationally, as if we were discussing the weather. "I've revoked it, along with your access to my accounts, my medical information, and any authority to make decisions on my behalf." The silence in the room was absolute. Even the children had stopped what they were doing, sensing that the adults were engaged in something serious and potentially explosive. "Mom, you can't just—" Michael began. "Actually, I can," I interrupted, pulling the legal documents from my purse with flourish of someone revealing a winning hand in poker. "I'm mentally competent, as 3 different doctors have now confirmed. I have every right to control my own affairs." "But who's going to help you manage everything?" Matthew asked, his voice carrying the patronizing tone I'd grown to despise. "You don't understand how complicated. I understand that you sold my house for $45,000 less than it was worth," I said, watching both their faces drain of color. "I understand that you've been using my debit card for personal expenses. I understand that you moved my money around without my knowledge or consent." Jennifer had followed me into the room and now stood behind the couch like a general surveying a battlefield where her side was clearly losing. "We were trying to simplify things for you," she said, her voice tight with the effort of maintaining composure. "Managing finances at your age is stressful. And you thought I was too old and stupid to notice I was being robbed," I said pleasantly. "By my own children." Emma looked up from her homework, her young face confused and distressed. "Dad? What's Grandma talking about?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Here was their carefully constructed narrative. The loving sons who'd made the difficult but necessary decision to place their mother in professional care, colliding with the reality of their systematic exploitation of a grieving widow. "It's complicated, sweetie," Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's really not," I said, looking directly at my granddaughter. "Your father and uncle took my money and my house and put me in a nursing home without asking what I wanted. Then they stopped calling or visiting, hoping I'd just disappear quietly." "That's not—" Matthew started. "When did you last visit me?" I asked, cutting him off. "When did you last call? When did you last ask how I was feeling or what I needed or whether I was lonely or scared or grieving for the only man I ever loved?" Neither of them answered, because we all knew the truth. They'd abandoned me emotionally long before they'd abandoned me physically. "You raised us to be independent," Michael said finally, grasping for justification. "You always said—" "I raised you to be decent human beings," I said, my voice rising for the first time. I raised you to understand that family means something more than convenience and financial benefit. I sacrificed everything, everything to give you opportunities I never had. And this is how you repay me? By stealing from me and dumping me like garbage? The room was completely silent now, except for the sound of Emma crying softly. Tyler had set down his game and was staring at his father with an expression I couldn't read. The twins had stopped building and were watching the adults with wide, frightened eyes. "We're going to fix this," Matthew said quietly. "Whatever mistakes we made, we'll fix them." "No," I said, standing up with a dignity I'd forgotten I possessed. "You're not going to fix anything. You're going to live with what you've done, and I'm going to live without you." I looked around the room one more time, at the expensive furniture bought with money that should have been mine, at the grandchildren I barely knew because my sons had trained them to see me as an obligation rather than a blessing, at the life I'd never been truly welcome in despite paying for so much of it. "Emma," I said, addressing my granddaughter directly, "I want you to know that I love you. I always have and I always will, but I won't be participating in this family anymore. If you ever want to know me, really know me, not the version your parents have told you about, you're welcome to find me. But it will have to be your choice." I walked toward the door, then turned back for one final word. "I hope someday you understand what you threw away," I said to my sons. "And I hope your children treat you better than you treated me." Then I left, closing the door softly behind me, and drove back to Decatur with something I hadn't felt in decades: the satisfaction of standing up for myself. The war wasn't over, but I'd won the first battle. And for the first time since Harold's death, I was looking forward to tomorrow. 6 months after the confrontation at Michael's house, I was standing in the kitchen of my new apartment, making coffee for one, and humming "Blue Moon," while golden morning light streamed through windows I'd chosen myself. The space was small, just a one-bedroom unit in a senior living community called Autumn Ridge, but it was mine in ways my previous home had never been. Everything in the apartment reflected choices I'd made for my own pleasure, rather than someone else's approval. The walls were painted a warm butter yellow that made me smile every morning. The furniture was comfortable rather than impressive. A reading chair positioned perfectly near the window, a dining table just large enough for me and whatever friends I might invite over, a bed with the softest sheets I'd ever owned, because I'd finally decided I deserved to sleep well. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. After leaving Michael's house that November evening, I'd spent 3 more months at Sunset Manor. Not because I had to, but because I was using the time to plan my next move carefully. Sarah, the facility administrator, had become an unexpected ally in my journey toward independence. When I'd explained my desire to move to a less institutional setting, she'd helped me research options that would provide the security of having medical care available without the feel of being warehoused. "You don't need assisted living," she'd said bluntly during one of our planning sessions. "You need community. You need a place where you can be yourself instead of just someone's abandoned mother." Autumn Ridge turned out to be exactly that kind of place. It was technically a senior living community, but it felt more like a small town where everyone happened to be over 60. There were independent apartments for people like me who could manage their own daily needs, assisted living units for those who needed more help, and a nursing facility for residents whose health required professional care. The beauty of the design was that people could move between levels of care as needed without leaving the community they'd built. I'd watched Dorothy make that transition when her arthritis worsened, moving from an apartment to assisted living, but continuing to join us for bridge games and movie nights. Yes, Dorothy had followed me to Autumn Ridge, along with Dr. Morrison and Ruth from the Herb Garden. We'd become an unlikely family of choice, bound together by our shared understanding that blood relations weren't the only way to create meaningful connections. "We're like plants that were in the wrong soil," Dorothy had said one evening as we sat on the community patio, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "Once we got transplanted to the right environment, we finally started to bloom, and I had bloomed, in ways I'd never imagined possible at 75 years old. The piano in Autumn Ridge's community center was a beautiful baby grand, donated by a resident's family who understood that music could transform a space from institutional to magical. I played there 3 times a week now, not just for residents, but for family members who visited, staff who stayed after their shifts to listen, and sometimes for small groups from the surrounding community who'd heard about our informal concerts. But more than that, I'd started taking formal piano lessons again. Every Tuesday afternoon, a young woman named Maria drove out from Springfield to work with me on pieces I'd always wanted to learn but never had time for. Chopin nocturnes that made me cry with their beauty, Debussy impressions that painted pictures in sound, Gershwin standards that made my fingers dance across the keys like they were 20 years old again. "You have natural musical instincts," Maria told me after I'd mastered a particularly challenging Chopin piece. "I think you could have been quite accomplished if you'd had the opportunity to develop your talent when you were younger. If you'd had the opportunity." Those words stayed with me long after Maria left that day. How many opportunities had I passed up over the years because someone else's needs seemed more important? How many versions of myself had I never explored because I was too busy being the person everyone else needed me to be? I was exploring them now. The writing class was Dr. Morrison's idea. He'd discovered that our community college offered continuing education courses specifically designed for seniors, and he'd convinced several of us to enroll in a memoir writing workshop. "We all have stories," he'd argued during one of our weekly discussion groups. "Stories that shouldn't die with us. Stories that might help other people understand their own lives better." I'd been skeptical at first. What did I have to write about? I was just a woman who'd lived an ordinary life, made ordinary mistakes, endured ordinary heartbreak. But under the guidance of Professor Williams, a retired English teacher who understood that every life contained elements worthy of examination, I'd begun to discover that my story, our stories, were anything but ordinary. The first essay I wrote was about the piano at Sunset Manor, about the way music had awakened something in me that I'd thought was dead. The second was about the morning I realized I'd stopped waiting for my sons to call. The third was about the day I'd driven to Michael's house and reclaimed my life. "You write with honesty and precision," Professor Williams had said when she handed back my latest piece. A reflection on what it meant to rebuild an identity at 75. "There's no self-pity in your voice, no bitterness. Just clear-eyed assessment of what was and what is. That's the mark of a natural storyteller." The writing had led to something I'd never expected: speaking engagements. First at our own community center, sharing my story with other residents who were struggling with family relationships or financial exploitation. Then at other senior living facilities in the region, where administrators had heard about the woman who'd successfully fought back against elder abuse and wanted me to inspire their residents. The most meaningful invitation had come from a women's shelter in Springfield, where the director had asked me to speak to older women who were leaving abusive relationships after decades of marriage. "Your story shows them that it's never too late to start over," she'd explained. "That age doesn't disqualify you from having a full, meaningful life on your own terms." Standing in front of those women, some in their 60s and 70s, all bearing the particular exhaustion that comes from years of diminishing yourself to survive someone else's cruelty, I'd felt a sense of purpose I'd never experienced during my decades of self-sacrifice. "I thought love meant disappearing," I'd told them. "I thought being a good woman meant having no needs, no preferences, no boundaries." I was wrong. Real love, whether it's from family or friends or partners, makes space for you to be fully yourself. Anything else is just exploitation wearing the mask of affection. After that talk, a woman named Janet had approached me with tears in her eyes. "I'm 72, she'd said. "I thought it was too late for me to leave. My children keep telling me I should be grateful that their father still wants me around. That at my age I'm lucky to have anyone." I'd given her my phone number and the contact information for the elder law attorney who'd helped me reclaim my financial independence. 6 months later, she'd moved into her own apartment and started volunteering at the local animal shelter, something she'd wanted to do for years, but her husband had forbidden because he didn't like dogs. The volunteer work had become another unexpected joy in my new life. Every Thursday morning, I drove to the county animal shelter and spent 3 hours socializing cats who'd been abandoned or surrendered by owners who could no longer care for them. The irony wasn't lost on me. Caring for creatures who'd been discarded by the people who were supposed to love them. But unlike my relationship with my sons, This caregiving filled me with energy rather than draining it. The cats didn't expect me to sacrifice my own well-being for theirs. They simply appreciated the attention, the gentle touch, the quiet companionship of someone who understood what it felt like to be unwanted. My favorite was an elderly orange tabby named Sunshine, who'd been surrendered when her 90-year-old owner moved to a nursing home that didn't allow pets. Sunshine was diabetic and arthritic, considered unadoptable by most standards, but she had a purr like a motorcycle engine and a way of looking at you that suggested she knew exactly how precious life was, even when it was difficult. "You two understand each other," said Karen, the shelter director, watching me give Sunshine her insulin injection with the competence of someone who'd spent years managing medical care for others. "We're both survivors," I'd replied, scratching behind Sunshine's ears until she closed her eyes in bliss. "We both know what it's like to be discarded and discover we're stronger than anyone expected." The financial independence I'd fought for had given me options I'd never imagined. Not wealth. I wasn't rich by any means. But freedom. Freedom to choose how to spend my days, where to live, what to learn, who to help. I'd used some of Harold's life insurance money to set up a small scholarship fund at the community college, specifically for women over 50 who were returning to education after major life changes. The first recipient had been Janet from the women's shelter, who was taking courses in bookkeeping so she could find employment that would support her newfound independence. "You're changing lives," Professor Williams had told me when I'd mentioned the scholarship during one of our writing classes. "Not just your own, but the lives of women who needed to see that transformation was possible." The most unexpected development in my new life had been romance. Well, the possibility of romance. Dr. Morrison, James, as I'd learned to call him, had become more than just a friend over the months we'd spent in discussion groups and writing classes together. He was a retired cardiologist whose wife had died 3 years earlier after a long battle with Alzheimer's disease. Like me, he'd spent years sacrificing his own needs to care for someone he loved, watching helplessly as the person he'd married slowly disappeared into illness and confusion. I forgot who I was outside of being Margaret's caregiver. He'd confided one evening as we walked through Autumn Ridge's garden paths, admiring the roses that bloomed despite the late-season chill. When she died, I had to relearn how to be just James instead of Margaret's husband. We'd been taking those evening walks together for 2 months now, sharing stories about our marriages, our children, our dreams for whatever years we had remaining. There was something restful about being with someone who understood that building a new life didn't mean erasing the old one, that you could honor what you'd lost while still embracing what you'd found. James had kissed me for the first time the previous week, gently, tentatively, like someone asking a question rather than making a demand. It had been sweet and careful, and nothing like the passionate romance of my youth with Harold, but it had been perfect for who I was now. A woman who understood the difference between needing someone and choosing to be with them. "I don't need to be anyone's everything," I'd told Dorothy the next day, trying to explain the feeling of possibility that had opened up in my chest. "And I don't need anyone to be my everything. I just want companionship with someone who sees me as I actually am." That, Dorothy had said with the wisdom of someone who'd lived through her own romantic disasters, is the secret to happiness at our age. Wanting each other rather than needing each other. The evening of my conversation with Dorothy, I'd been sitting on my apartment balcony, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky, and thinking about the strange journey that had brought me to this moment of contentment. When my phone rang, the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. But when I answered, I heard a voice that made my heart skip. "Grandma Carolyn? It's Emma." Emma, my granddaughter, now 18 and about to graduate from high school, calling me of her own accord for the first time since that devastating confrontation at her parents' house. "Emma, sweetheart," I said, trying to keep the emotion out of my voice. "How did you get this number?" "I hired a private investigator," she said, and I could hear both pride and nervousness in her voice. "Well, not really. I just asked a lot of questions and did some internet searching. I found out you moved to Autumn Ridge, and they gave me your number when I said I was your granddaughter." A long pause. during which I could hear her breathing and what sounded like traffic in the background. "I wanted to talk to you before I leave for college," she continued. "I wanted to understand what really happened. Dad and Uncle Matthew, they've been saying things about you, about why you left. But I remember what you said that night, and I've been thinking about it for months." Smart girl. My granddaughter had inherited the intelligence that ran in our family, but unlike her father and uncle, she was using it to seek truth rather than justify cruelty. "What have they been saying?" I asked, genuinely curious about how my sons had spun the narrative of my escape. "That you were confused, that grief made you paranoid and suspicious, that you didn't understand how much they were trying to help you." Emma's voice grew stronger, more confident. "But then I started paying attention to how they talk about other people, how they treat Mom when they think no one's listening, how they handle money and responsibility. And I realized they might have done exactly what you said they did, out of the mouths of babes." This 18-year-old had seen through her father's carefully constructed justifications with the clarity that comes from not being invested in maintaining comfortable lies. "I'm proud of you for thinking critically," I said carefully. "That's not always easy when it involves people you love." "I want to see you," Emma said in a rush. "Before I leave for Northwestern, I want to understand who you really are, not just the version of you that Dad talks about. Would that be okay? Would it be okay?" This child, this young woman, wanted to know me. After months of believing I'd lost my entire family, one member had chosen to reach out across the divide her father had created. "It would be more than okay," I said, tears streaming down my face in the darkness. "It would be the best gift you could possibly give me." We made plans to meet the following weekend at Autumn Ridge. I would cook her dinner, her choice of menu, and we would talk. Really talk, without the filter of parents who had their own agendas to protect. As I hung up the phone and sat in the gentle spring air, surrounded by the sounds of a community where I'd found my place, I realized something that would have seemed impossible a year ago. I was truly, completely happy. Not the desperate happiness of someone trying to convince herself that sacrifice was noble, or the bitter satisfaction of someone who'd gotten revenge on people who'd wronged her. This was the deep, quiet happiness of someone who'd finally learned to live for herself, while still having love to give to others. I was no longer Michael and Matthew's discarded mother. I was Carolyn Foster, pianist and writer and volunteer and friend. I was a woman who'd found her own worth and built a life that reflected her own values. And for the first time in my 75 years, that was enough. 2 years after Emma's first visit to Autumn Ridge, I was standing in the community center, adjusting the microphone before addressing a room full of women ranging in age from 55 to 89. The monthly gathering had grown from the handful of residents who'd attended my first informal talk to a regional event that drew participants from 3 counties. "Ladies," I said, looking out at faces that reflected every stage of the journey from despair to empowerment. "Today, I want to talk about the difference between being valuable and being valued." In the front row sat Emma, now 20 and home from college for spring break. She'd been attending these talks whenever she was in town, bringing friends and taking notes like she was studying for an exam on how to build a meaningful life. Beside her sat Janet, whose transformation from abused wife to confident animal welfare advocate had inspired a dozen other women to make their own escapes. Dr. Morrison, James, occupied his usual seat near the piano, ready to provide musical accompaniment if the mood called for it. "For most of my adult life," I continued, "I confused these two concepts. I thought being valuable meant making myself useful to other people, regardless of how they treated me in return. I thought my worth was measured by how much I was willing to sacrifice, how much inconvenience I was willing to absorb, how completely I could disappear to make room for everyone else's needs." Murmurs of recognition rippled through the audience. These women knew exactly what I was talking about. The slow erosion of self that happened when you spent decades believing that love meant having no boundaries. But being valued, truly valued, means being appreciated for who you are, not what you can provide. It means being seen as a whole person with your own dreams, opinions, and needs. It means having relationships where the giving flows both ways. A woman in the third row raised her hand. Patricia, whose son had been pressuring her to sell her house and move in with his family so they could benefit from her Social Security income while providing minimal care in return. "How do you know when you're being used versus when family really needs help?" she asked. It was a question I'd heard variations of dozens of times, and I understood why it was so difficult to answer. The line between legitimate family support and exploitation wasn't always clear, especially when manipulative people were skilled at presenting their demands as expressions of love. "Ask yourself this," I said. "When you help them, do you feel energized or drained? Do they express genuine gratitude or act like you owe them your assistance? Do they consider your needs and limitations, or do they expect you to sacrifice your well-being for their convenience? Most importantly, are you allowed to say no without being made to feel guilty, selfish, or ungrateful?" Patricia nodded slowly, and I could see the recognition dawning in her eyes. Her son's requests weren't requests at all. They were demands disguised as opportunities for her to prove her love. "The other thing to remember," I added, "is that healthy families don't operate like businesses where one person is expected to be the permanent provider while others are permanent recipients. Love should be mutual, even if it doesn't always flow equally at any given moment." After the formal presentation, during the coffee and conversation period that had become as important as the talks themselves, Emma approached me with a young man I didn't recognize. "Grandma Carolyn," she said, using the name that had evolved from Grandma to something that felt more like a title of respect than a mere family designation. "I'd like you to meet David. He's in my sociology program at Northwestern." David appeared to be about Emma's age, with dark hair and the earnest expression of someone who took academic work seriously. He shook my hand with the careful politeness of a young person who'd been taught to respect his elders. "Emma's told me about your story," he said. "I'm writing my senior thesis on elder abuse and family dynamics, and I was wondering if you might be willing to be interviewed for my research." I looked at Emma, who was trying to appear casual while clearly being very invested in my answer. "What specific aspect of the issue are you studying?" I asked. "The long-term psychological and social impacts on survivors who successfully escape exploitative family situations," David said. "Most research focuses on the abuse itself, but very little examines what happens to people who manage to rebuild their lives afterward. Emma suggested that your experience might provide valuable insights." Emma had been watching my transformation for 2 years now, visiting regularly, bringing friends, sometimes staying for weekend retreats where we'd cook together, and I'd teach her piano pieces, and she'd help me with the computer skills needed for my writing and advocacy work. She'd seen me evolve from the bitter, abandoned woman who'd confronted her father to someone who'd found genuine contentment and purpose. "I'd be honored to contribute to research that might help other people," I said. "But I have one condition." David nodded eagerly. "I want the research to emphasize that recovery is possible at any age. Too many people assume that if you reach your 70s and haven't figured out how to stand up for yourself, you never will. That's not true. Age can actually be an advantage. You have less to lose and more clarity about what really matters." Over the following months, as David conducted his interviews and Emma finished her sophomore year, I found myself reflecting more deeply on the journey that had brought me to this point. The conversations with David forced me to articulate insights I developed intuitively, to examine the specific factors that had enabled my transformation. The financial independence had been crucial, of course. Without the ability to control my own resources, I never could have escaped the cycle of dependence and manipulation. But equally important had been the community I'd found at Autumn Ridge. People who saw me as Carolyn rather than as someone's discarded mother. "You needed witnesses," James observed one evening as we walked through the garden where we'd had so many important conversations. "People who could see your worth when you'd forgotten it yourself." He was right. Dorothy, Dr. Xiao, Morrison himself, Ruth, the women in my writing class, the cats at the animal shelter, they'd all served as mirrors that reflected back a version of myself I'd lost sight of during those years of diminishing returns from my sons. "The piano was important too," I said, thinking about how music had been the first thing to awaken my sense of personal identity. Having something that was mine, that brought me joy without requiring me to serve anyone else. We'd had this conversation many times, but it never felt repetitive. Both of us were still marveling at the possibility of building meaningful lives in our 70s, still grateful for the second chance we'd found together. Our relationship had deepened naturally over the 2 years, progressing from friendship to companionship to something that felt like love, though different from the passionate romance of our youth. We maintained separate apartments but spent most evenings together, sharing meals and books and quiet conversation. There had been talk of marriage, but we'd both decided that formal commitment felt less important than the daily choice to remain in each other's lives. I like knowing I'm with you because I want to be, not because legal papers say I have to be, I'd told him, and he'd understood completely. The call came on a Tuesday morning in May, while I was preparing for another speaking engagement at a women's shelter in Peoria. Emma's name appeared on my phone screen, but when I answered, she was crying so hard I could barely understand her. "Grandma Carolyn," she sobbed. "It's Dad. He had a heart attack. He's in the hospital." The news hit me like a physical blow, not because I still loved Michael in the way I once had, but because he was still my child, still the baby I'd carried and raised and sacrificed for. Whatever he'd done to me, whatever damage he'd inflicted, the maternal instinct doesn't disappear just because your children betray you. "How bad is it?" I asked, already reaching for my car keys. "They don't know yet. Mom's at the hospital, but she's a mess. And Uncle Matthew is trying to handle everything, but he's scared too." Emma's voice broke completely. Would you consider coming? I know you don't owe us anything, but..." An hour later, I was walking through the familiar corridors of Springfield Memorial Hospital, the same building where Harold had died 2.5 years earlier. The cardiac care unit was on the 4th floor, in a wing I'd never had reason to visit before. I found Emma in the waiting room, looking younger than her 20 years, surrounded by the debris of a family in crisis. Jennifer sat slumped in a plastic chair, her usually perfect appearance disheveled and tear-stained. Matthew paced near the windows, talking urgently on his phone, probably with insurance companies or Michael's business partners. When Emma saw me, she ran across the room and threw her arms around me with the desperation of someone who'd been drowning and suddenly found solid ground. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. "I wasn't sure you would." "You're my granddaughter," I said simply. "Of course I came." Jennifer looked up at my approach, her face cycling through surprise, relief, and something that might have been shame. We hadn't spoken since that confrontational evening at Michael's house, though Emma had told me that her parents' marriage had been strained since then, as if my departure had somehow destabilized the family dynamics they'd taken for granted. "Carolyn," Jennifer said, her voice thick with exhaustion, "I thank you for coming. I know things have been..." "How is he?" I asked, cutting through the awkwardness with the practical focus that crisis often requires. "Stable for now. They did emergency surgery to place stents in 2 arteries. The doctor says the next 24 hours are critical." She looked down at her hands, twisted with anxiety. "He's been under so much stress lately. Work, money, other things." Matthew approached, ending his phone call and looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Unlike his twin, he'd lost weight over the past 2 years, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Mom," he said quietly, I'm glad you're here." The next 12 hours passed in the strange suspended time of hospital waiting, where minutes felt like hours, and every sound from the corridor might signal good news or disaster. I sat with Emma, held Jennifer when she needed to cry, and made phone calls to people who needed to know about Michael's condition, his business partner, a few close friends, the school where Emma would miss classes. It was the kind of crisis management I'd done countless times during Harold's illness, but with a crucial difference. I was choosing to help rather than being expected to handle everything alone. When the doctor finally emerged with the news that Michael was stable and asking for family, there was an awkward moment of uncertainty about whether I qualified as family anymore. Emma solved it by taking my hand and saying firmly, "She's my grandmother. She belongs here." Michael looked pale and fragile in the hospital bed, connected to monitors that beeped steadily, surrounded by the sterile efficiency of modern medical care. When he saw me, his eyes filled with tears. "Mom," he whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." I looked at this middle-aged man who was still my son, despite everything that had happened between us, and felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly. That would take more time and more conversation, but a recognition that holding on to anger was only hurting me now. "Focus on getting better," I said, squeezing his hand. "We'll talk about everything else later." Over the following weeks, as Michael recovered and began the difficult process of acknowledging the extent of his wrongdoing, I found myself in an unexpected position, the family member everyone turned to for stability and wisdom. Not because I was willing to sacrifice myself again, but because I'd learned how to offer support without losing myself in the process. I helped coordinate Michael's care, but I didn't become his primary caregiver. I provided emotional support to Emma and Jennifer, but I maintained my own boundaries and returned to my own life at Autumn Ridge each evening. "You're different," Jennifer said one afternoon as we sat in Michael's hospital room while he slept. "Stronger, but also calmer. Like you're not angry anymore." "I'm not angry," I said, surprising myself with how true that was. I was, for a while, but anger is exhausting, and I decided I had better ways to spend my energy. The conversation that needed to happen took place 3 weeks later, when Michael was home and recovering well enough to engage in difficult discussions. He'd asked Emma to arrange a family meeting, just the 4 of us, in his living room where I'd confronted him 2 years earlier. But this time, the power dynamic was completely different. I wasn't a desperate woman fighting for scraps of acknowledgement. I was someone who'd built a full, meaningful life, and was choosing to engage with family from a position of strength rather than need. "I want to apologize," Michael said, his voice steady but emotional. "Not just for the financial stuff, though that was inexcusable, for all of it. For treating you like a problem to be solved instead of a person to be loved. For making decisions about your life without including you. For abandoning you when you needed us most." I listened without interrupting, recognizing the sincerity in his voice, but also understanding that apologies, however heartfelt, couldn't undo the damage that had been done. "I need you to understand something," I said when he'd finished. "I forgive you, but forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean pretending the past didn't happen, or that we can go back to the relationship we had before." Michael nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I've built a new life," I continued. "A good life, with people who value me for who I am, rather than what I can provide. I'm not the same woman you abandoned 2 years ago. I won't be returning to that role." "What does that mean for us?" Emma asked quietly. I looked at my granddaughter, this remarkable young woman who'd had the courage to seek me out and rebuild our relationship on her own terms. "It means we start over," I said. "With honesty this time. With boundaries this time. With the understanding that family relationships have to be mutual to be meaningful." 6 months later, I was back in the community center at Autumn Ridge, addressing another gathering of women who were struggling with family exploitation and abandonment. But this time, Emma sat in the front row taking notes not for a sociology project, but because she'd decided to change her major to social work and wanted to focus on elder advocacy. "The question people ask me most often," I told the audience, "is whether I regret confronting my sons, whether I wish I'd tried harder to preserve the family relationships." I paused, looking out at faces that reflected every stage of the journey from victimhood to empowerment. "Here's what I've learned. You can't save relationships that are built on your willingness to be diminished. You can't preserve love that requires you to have no needs, no boundaries, no sense of your own worth." A woman in the back row raised her hand. "But what if they're your children? What if cutting them off means losing your grandchildren too?" It was a question that cut to the heart of every mother's dilemma. The fear that standing up for yourself would cost you the people you loved most. "Sometimes," I said gently, "you have to be willing to lose the relationship you have in order to create space for the relationship you deserve. Sometimes you have to model self-respect before other people will learn to respect you." I looked at Emma, who was nodding as she scribbled notes. In my case, temporarily losing my family taught them something important. That I was a person worth fighting to keep, that my presence in their lives was a gift, not a burden they had to manage. After the formal presentation, as women clustered in small groups sharing their own stories and strategies, Emma approached me with a question that had clearly been on her mind for a while. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found the strength to leave? If you'd just stayed at Sunset Manor and accepted what Dad and Uncle Matthew did to you? I considered the question seriously, thinking about the woman I'd been 2.5 years ago. Broken, abandoned, convinced that she deserved whatever scraps of attention her children were willing to offer. I think I would have died there, I said honestly. Not physically necessarily, though the despair might have shortened my life, but I would have died spiritually. The part of me that was uniquely Carolyn, separate from my roles as wife and mother, would have withered away completely. Emma nodded thoughtfully. And now? I looked around the room at the community I'd helped create, the women I'd inspired to claim their own worth, the meaningful work that had emerged from my own transformation. Now I'm more myself than I've ever been. I'm living proof that it's never too late to discover who you really are when you're not busy being who everyone else needs you to be. That evening, as James and I walked through the garden paths that had become the setting for so many important conversations, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this moment of contentment. Do you ever regret the years you spent sacrificing for your children? He asked, echoing Emma's earlier question. I regret not understanding sooner that sacrifice without appreciation becomes martyrdom, I said. I regret not teaching them that love is supposed to be mutual. But I don't regret loving them, even though they weren't worthy of it at the time. We stopped near the rose garden that Ruth had planted before her arthritis forced her to move to assisted living. The flowers were past their peak now, but still beautiful in the way that impermanent things often are. The hardest lesson I had to learn, I continued, was that you can love someone completely while still refusing to be treated badly by them. That sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to stop enabling someone's worst impulses. James took my hand, his fingers warm and steady in the evening air. And the most important lesson? He asked. I thought about all the women I'd spoken to over the past 2 years. All the stories of transformation and recovery. All the proof that human resilience could overcome even the deepest betrayals. That you are never too old to start over. That as long as you're breathing, you have the chance to become who you were meant to be. As we walked back toward the community center, where the lights were just beginning to come on, and other residents were gathering for the evening's activities, I felt the deep satisfaction of someone who'd not just survived abandonment, but had transformed it into purpose. My sons had tried to erase me, to reduce me to a financial obligation that could be managed from a distance. Instead, they'd inadvertently freed me to discover what I was capable of when I stopped trying to earn love through self-sacrifice. I'd become someone who helped other women find their own strength, someone who created community through music and storytelling, someone who loved and was loved not because of what I could provide, but because of who I was. Most importantly, I'd become someone who knew her own worth and wouldn't settle for anything less than being truly valued. And if that wasn't the definition of a life well lived, I didn't know what was. The last thought I want to leave you with tonight is this. Have you ever found yourself sacrificing so much for family that you lost sight of who you were underneath all that giving? Have you ever loved someone who took your devotion for granted? Share your story in the comments below. If this message resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps ensure that stories like Carolyn's reach other people who need to hear that it's never too late to reclaim your worth and build a life that honors who you really are.